Hello and welcome. We are in January of 2024 and I am going to talk about the 12 books that I read this month. And I'm really excited because I read pretty representative of my kind of books across genre. So that was really fun. I read 3 fantasy, I read some literary fiction, I read poetry, I read a children's picture book, which was just great. I'm such a mood reader, which means that sometimes I'll read like 40 comics for like 5 months. And then I will read only classics for like several months, and then I'll only read literary fiction or contemporary or romance, and I'll just like go into those genres and I won't come out. Like last year is a great example. In January I read 1 classic, in June I read 1 classic, and like by that point I was like, wow, I'm not reading classic books. And then from September to the end of December I read primarily classics, and it became my most read genre of the year. I'm gonna talk about my 3 classics first because I started the year with classics. The first book is a layover from my last book of the year, which was Mary Barton. This is a book by Elizabeth Gaskell. It was published in 1848, and it looks at unions and mills and poverty and the way that industrialization has affected people in England in this era. It is one of the most poignant representations of poverty and of all of those things that I've ever read. It is so hard of a book to read at times, and I was just really emotional reading it, but the poetry and the writing of it was so clear. I wouldn't say that Mary Barton is a heroine that I felt akin to in the same way that Margaret Hale from North and South, which takes a lot of the same aspects and is published 6 years later, does, but it is a book that I still really liked. And yeah, I think that Elizabeth Gaskell is quickly becoming a favorite author of mine. I think that she dives into social issues and the characters between classes and religion and work and unions so well. I really enjoy her work. I'm going to read this section. It's going to talk a lot about poverty and hunger and all of those things. There were homes over which the Carsons' fire drew a deep, terrible gloom. The homes of those whom leisure was a curse. There the family music was hungry wails when week after week passed by and there was no work to be had, and consequently no wages to pay for the bread the children cried aloud for in their young impatience of suffering. Their lounge was taken in bed to try to keep warmth in them that bitter March weather, and by being quiet to deaden the gnawing wolf within. Like that picture of how hunger is just like consuming them. And this is right after it talks about the people who are these businessmen who, because of the fire, they actually have leisure to like hang out with their families. And we're seeing both sides of it. And then there's this talk about how even in this lack and in this need, that some people showed great mercy. And this quote, it just sums up some element of Elizabeth Gaskell's philosophy on this, which I loved. The vices of the poor sometimes astound us here, but when the secrets of all their hearts shall be made known, their virtues will astound us in far greater degree. Of this I am certain. I think that is such a beautiful sentiment. The idea that yes, when people are in want and poverty and they're seeing their children die and freeze to death, they will be angry. But then also people go out of their way to be kind. And I just love this. Shortly before this in December, I'd read Of Those Whose Names Are Unknown, and this is by Sonora Babb, and it's set in the Great Depression in America. And I think that these books have similar elements of looking at poverty and the extreme degree of want, but also highlighting people's love for their neighbors and coming alongside each other. So I really liked this book, and it was a great way to start the year. The next book that I picked up was Phineas Finn, and this is by Anthony Trollope. It is the second book in his Palliser novels, and I found this really interesting. It is looking at a young Irishman who wants to be a politician, and we follow his life and the various people around him, and he is definitely not the most likable of Anthony Trollope's characters, although Anthony Trollope's heroes tend to have some want of courtesy at times. They're good in their heart, we tell, but also they all make questionable decisions at times as well. And yes, I liked this, and I've already started Eustace Diamonds, which is the 3rd book, so yeah, I just think that Anthony Trollope is a really funny and clever human writer that his books are long, but they never feel that way. I just get intoxicated by them and I want to stay in this world and to live in there, and it is just really lovely. The 3rd book that I'm going to talk about, I read a little bit later in the month, but as it's a classic, I will fit it here. And this is Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. And I've been reading through the Brontes. I have previously read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and this is also by Charlotte Bronte, who did Jane Eyre. And it is a very different book. It is very manufacturers and deals with unions and all those elements just in a smaller town. And it fits very interestingly with Mary Barton, and they were published in the same year. And I wondered at one point if they had talked about these books, because Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Bronte's were friends, and Elizabeth Gaskell later wrote Charlotte's biography. So I was like, did they know these things and talk about them? But they met 1 year after both of these books were published. But it was such an interesting thing to read these books so close together and see the ways in which these elements are dealt with. This book is called Shirley, but it actually follows primarily a girl named Caroline. She is a girl who was left orphaned by a mother who abandoned her and a father who was cruel and died. And she's being raised by her uncle, who is a very interesting person. I actually really find his characterization interesting because he's very absent and not very loving toward her. He's not cruel, like he does care about her, but he's just like doesn't have much attention for her, and he just like kind of neglects her. But at the same time, he's like a very charming, very personable man in the world. Like he kind of views his socialization as something that he should do outside of the home. So in the home, he's just like very quiet and doesn't really talk about things. Fairly recently, Caroline's cousins, who were born in Belgium, have come over, and one of them is a mill owner and one of them is a younger sister named Hortense. They both speak French and they have accents, and she's a little bit in love with Robert, who is the older brother, but she is tutored by Hortense, who just wants to be slightly arrogant and over her. It was really delightful to watch it unfold because I was not very intrigued. Like I almost DNF'd at about 15%, and when I was talking about the classics I was going to read, I was talking about how I was reading this, and I wasn't that into it. But then something changed and I became really enamored with it, and as the story came on and we meet Shirley as well, who is such an interesting character, I really loved aspects of that. And one of the things that is really fascinating about this novel is how much it deals with grief. I wrote a very long review of this book, and in this I talk a lot about Charlotte Bronte's own life, because when she started this book, she had a different plan for it, and during the writing of this book, 3 of her siblings died. Charlotte Bronte was originally the third-born child of her parents, but her 2 older sisters died before she turned 10. So she started this book in the summer of 1847, and then shortly after that, in September, her brother Bromwell died, and that was really devastating. And then her sister Emily died in December, and her sister Anne died in May. And how devastating that is to, she was once a middle child, to end up as an only child, and to have 3 of them die in less than 1 year is... I cannot imagine that grief. And there's elements of this book that talk about grief in such a poignant way, and I thought that was excellent. There are characters we are introduced and we are immediately told that they will die young, which feels wrong, and it talks about how much life they have, and yet they will be dead before they grow up. It also deals a lot with unrequited love in really interesting ways. One of the quotes that I really love is, "She was feeling how exclusively she had attached herself to the white cottage in the hollow, how in the existence of one inmate of that cottage she had pent all her universe." And I thought that quote shows how clearly like love can consume us, and how like she was so set on her cousin being in love with her, and when that does not pan out the way that she thinks that it's going to, how much that changes her world. I wouldn't describe Shirley as like a banger of a book. Like it didn't like completely wow me, but I think that it's a book that slowly crawled itself into my heart and has made something there. The next book I want to talk about is Galatea by our queen, Madeline Miller. I've previously both read Circe back at the beginning of my channel, and I had some thoughts. I don't think I would stand by all those thoughts anymore, but it was really interesting to go back and see some of my initial thoughts about Madeline Miller. And then also I have read Son of Achilles, which I cried so much during, and her writing is just epic and amazing. I have a long history with Madeline Miller, and she has become very close to my heart, and this book is just incredible. Like it is a short story she originally published back in like 2013 or something like that, and it has been republished because of how popular she has become in later years. It recasts the story of Galatea and Pygmalion. So Pygmalion I primarily know from Our Fair Lady, like that play by George Bernard Shaw, but the original Greek myth is about a man who is a sculptor, and he creates his sculpture and makes her perfectly, and then she comes alive. And in most of these renditions she never speaks. So this recast the story in a feminist lens about this idea of this man who has made this beautiful sculpture and then she's come alive, and he doesn't want her to exist. He wants her to be, perfect and all of these elements, and she has her own agency, and it's this man who thinks he's so wonderful and great, and she knows that if she ever lets on that she does not think of him that way, that he will hurt her. And it is heart-wrenching, and it deals a lot with like misogyny and marital like rape and all of those elements that are really hard. But I think that it's such a powerful book, and like I could sit in it and listen to like every word that she wrote over and over again and be like just aghast at how beautiful it is. and how much it hits on the theme that feels universal in the way that women must cater themselves to men to not be hurt. And wow, like I was shocked. Like I was shocked at how much I love this. Like I knew that I would, but like from its opening pages, I was just like, my goodness, this book. From there, I read 3 wonderful fantasy sci-fi YA books, or new adults, I think, technically. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Divine Rivals. This is a book I know many people have talked about, and I got it from one of my friends who is getting back into reading, and she was like, please, like I've heard so many things about these books, get it for me. And then she got it, and I got it from the library, and we both read it, and I was just gushing over it. I love a good press story, and I think that the way that the gods deal with it is really interesting. If you like this book, which I know is really popular, there's a book called Lovely War by Julie Berry, and I think that that has interesting elements of that as well. I read Immortal Longings, which is an Antony and Cleopatra retelling, and this is by Chloe Gong, who I have had a very good track record by so far, and I had read her These Violent Delights and These Violent Ends and Foul Lady Fortune, and I love them, and they blew me out of the water. I think that she retells Shakespeare plays so well. I had read Last Violent Call in the spring, and I hadn't been very enthused by it, but I was like, it's a novella, I get it. And this one, I felt similarly. I probably would have DNF'd it if I didn't love Chloe Gong. It's retelling Cleopatra and Antony, but it is definitely diverting more than you would imagine. But it has some Hunger Games kind of Colosseum aspect, and it also has body jumping. So pretty much people can jump from body to body to body, and this helps people stay outside of identity. Like we don't ever know who these people are. And the magic system is interesting, and some of the characters are interesting. It took me a long time to like feel invested, to feel like these characters I knew. And part of it is because there's a lot of history we haven't really seen in flashbacks. We get jumped into the story that has been ongoing for a long time. Also, the characters we follow are people who are being very alienated from their communities and from people, and they primarily don't wear the faces that they were born with. So like because they're changing and adapting, and they just don't have these strong roots. And I love the strong roots. Like I want family and development and like all of these things. And when characters don't have strong relationships, I don't feel as connected. And I definitely was intrigued. Like some people like panned this book, and I definitely wouldn't pan it. I'm excited to read second book, but it's definitely not a top tier book for me. And then as the last book of the month, I read Foul Heart Huntsman, which was the end of the duology in her, interconnected books, which started with These Violent Ends. And it takes place in Shanghai in the 1930s, and it deals with spies. And I didn't like this one either. And I hate that because I have been like a cheerleader of Chloe Gong from the beginning, and these were 3 books that all came out in 2023. And I have heard some online discourse about how like, maybe she should have taken more time to edit these books rather than like, be pushing through 3 books in a year. And I can see some of that. I can see some of the complaints because this is a book that, there was elements of it that I still really liked. And I think a big part of it is how the first book ended, which I thought was like, it's one of those jaw ending, like, but it definitely changed the stakes for book 2. It's a plot point that I can't spoil, but it definitely lessened my enjoyment of the book overall. And it made me feel very unmoored and unconnected to the characters. And yes, it also has been like a year and a half-ish since I read the first book. So there was elements of the characters that I was like trying to remember who these people were and how they connected. And the first book deals with these few people who don't get along very well and are spies, and they're typically assassins, but they are put undercover together to act as a married couple to infiltrate a different part of the government to try to get intel. And I love a good fake marriage plot, so I was definitely, primed to love that part. And that element of the plot wasn't present in the second book, so I feel like some of my fake marriage part was, lessened, etc. But yes, I definitely will continue on with Chloe Gong. I've now read 6 or 7 of her books, but I'm not necessarily completely enthused like I was when I read the first 3 of her books. I'm a huge fan of Aubrey Gordon and the podcast Maintenance Phase. I am a longtime fan, and this is her book, You Just Need to Lose Weight, and 19 Other Myths About Fat People. And this book was really good. I really enjoy books that are, talking about the ways that implicit bias goes in the medical system, goes into the media, goes into the way that people understand weight. And I just think that it's such a powerful book. I knew most of her content because I am an avid listener and re-listener to her podcast. So a lot of it I was like, yes. And I've heard more details, and we're like back and forth with her and Michael, which is always just great. Anyways, I still really enjoyed this, and I think that it was a really helpful book. I've had ongoing struggles with eating disorders, and I've talked about this a little bit on the channel, but it was a time that I was having a really hard time, and I was like, you know what, I just need some Aubrey Gordon inserted into my brain, and that was what I needed. I think she does a really good job of looking at intersectional lens on fatness and on the way that we interpret fatness and all of those elements. And yes, if you want to read this book, I really recommend it. If you don't want to buy this book, don't have access through a library, I really recommend Maintenance Phase. It's a fantastic podcast. It will make you laugh. It will give you information. I love all of that. I also read How Far You've Come, which is a poetry collection looking at inspiration. I find these collections by Morgan, Harper, and Nichols just so wonderful. She does beautiful illustrations throughout, and she just has a lot of encouraging things. Let me just read this. Come back down in the beat of your heart. Come back to the joy of color. Come back to believing hope still runs in your veins. You're finding your way in the wind, but you can always come back to the light. It's very simple poetry. It's the poetry that some people might roll their eyes on, and I will roll their eyes on them because I think that being highbrow and pretentious is dumb. So yes, I love these encouraging poems. I follow her on Instagram, and I love that she has encouraging things throughout the months, and I love that I bought these for my roommate because I borrow them whenever I'm having a hard time. The next book that I read was Time Shelter, and this won the International Booker Prize last year, and I was very overjoyed because I was all for it. There's these two guys, and one of them is grand and has plans on this business, and one of them is a writer. And these two guys team up to make a world in which people who are experiencing memory loss from old age can go back into the past and feel comforted so that they're not taken out and their confusion is not more. And they hunt down all of these elements to perfectly synthesize the different worlds that were in the 1980s or the 1940s, etc. And it's really interesting. And as time goes on, and the world becomes enamored with it. And meanwhile, there's this like slow understanding that people are forgetting things. People are not remembering what came before or the present. And we have these reenactments. We have this wonderful story, which was one of my favorite aspects. We have this man who was against the Soviets, but was in Russia, etc. And we have the man who was a spy on him throughout his life. And when he is losing his memory, he asks for this man, and this man comes, and these people who, like, this man was always like below him and watching him, but they never ever interacted, and now they become friends because they're the only parts of each other that remembered it. Like, his wives divorced him, his friends aren't there, but there's one man who was like stuck watching him for 40 years, knows everything about him. It is such an interesting way. This writer has a really unique way of writing that is really interesting. He talks a lot about writers of the past and history, and it does feel like a history lesson when also talking about like writing and time, and these characters are also like deeply personal. I really liked it, and I love looking at an Eastern European perspective on these topics. This one was translated from the Bulgarian. At the halfway point, I felt like it was almost over, and I was like, I was ready. And then the second half of the book definitely did drag for me a little more, but I think that it was really intriguing, and it looks at the ways in which the whole world wants to go back. So we talk about different European countries, what time period they go back to, and, you know, should we feel guilty if we're in the wartime, or like all of these different aspects. And it is a lot about how we forget about the past, and how do we relive the past because we forget about it. And it is such an amazing thematic book that I really enjoyed. And then near the end of the month, I had a desire to read comics, which I love because I love comics, and I have a bunch that I'm going to read in February. But this one I picked up, and this is Local Man, and this is by Tim Seeley. This is Image Comics, which means that it's not in the DC or Marvel universe. This is set in its own world. And this is a 90s comic written in the 2020s. Both of them grew up being obsessed with comics and writing their own comics when they were younger, and these characters feature in this. So Local Man, this guy, is a guy in which he created when he was 15, and now we're looking back as if this was 30 years in the future. And it's super interesting to look at his initial draft and how, you know, he imagined this history, and now he is a man who is being disgraced, and he is being exiled from their version of kind of the Justice League or Avengers. And yeah, he is going back to his own town, but people have thoughts about him. It is a book that definitely has a lot of mature topics and conversations, and I really appreciated the way that it did. It dealt sometimes very unflattering with Christians, which I understand. Christians can be a lot, I say as a Christian, but there was an element where their version of Superman, who's a little bit more like I'm forgetting his name, from the boys. He's empowered by Christian morality and the right to bear arms, and I was like, oh man. And then we see him exercising by like lifting giant crosses, and I was like, okay, I get it. But as someone who is a Canadian and Christian who very, very, very against like the right to bear arms and stuff like that, I understand the critique there. I just think that there's more than one version of Christianity out there, and that Christianity was a lot. I need to share my favorite part of the comic, which is at the beginning, where we kind of find out that he's not allowed to be a superhero because this meta humor is fantastic. And it's because someone attacks him and he like puts up a shield to block himself, and his superpower is that pretty much any weapon that he picks up, he will always shoot straight. Then his old team comes to like sue him, and they said, as per your contract termination, you aren't allowed to use any shield. It was a garbage can lid or shield-like object. The name Crossjack, which is his superhuman name, is copyrighted intellectual property of the Third Gen Enterprises. Other violations of said contract include solving crimes, battling superhuman villains, non-superhuman villains, or engaging in large-scale events against cosmic or other infinitely powerful beings. That part just got me. It was the shield-like object and engaging in battle with superhuman or non-superhuman entities. Just excellent. That is my kind of humor. I just ate it up. I had a lot of fun. This is the first run that came out in 2023, and it will continue into 2024, and I am eagerly awaiting that. And then last, but certainly not least, I had a blast with There Was a Party for Langston. Jason Reynolds is an author that I really love, whatever I read by him, and this is a picture book that was inspired by a picture that he saw of Maya Angelou and Amiri. I'm not as familiar with him, but they are two Black legends, and they are dancing. And the reason is because they have a library opening in honor of Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes is an author that I have previously read. I got like a collection this big back in 2018 of all his poetry that was 800 pages long. And I read like at least 50, if not 100 pages of it. And I was like, this is great. I can't read all of this. So I definitely like need to engage with a smaller collection of his books. But he does have such wonderful writing, and Jason Reynolds really echoes the way that he like writes and other people writes, and it's just a wonderful picture book celebrating like Black people and literary history. I love this because during the time that they're celebrating it, we have the living authors at the time like Maya Angelou and stuff sitting and standing there, and then we also have the rows of libraries and we have them looking down on them, and it's just like, it's a beautiful legacy. I took some screenshots from my Libby app, so I will share some of those, but I really recommend this book. Like one of the lines was like, a poem can feel like a mother's arms, and just like showing the way that writing can feel, and it was just so great. I really recommend it. So yes, that was my books that I read in January. They ran the gambit across. They were, for the most part, really good books. I gave most of them 4 stars. I had a really great time. Galatea was a 5-star, and then Foul Heart, Fortune, and Immortal Longings were both 3 stars, which might have been 2 stars if I didn't have an affinity for her, I will be honest. And yeah, I hope to see you next time. Let me know what books you read in January, what books I should pick up because I love these books. And yeah, I will see you next time.